start the hour with Zac Goldsmith, who is, of course, Conservative MP for Richmond Park, but important in the context of this conversation, the Conservative mayoral candidate. And you can't quite count the weeks, but certainly you can count the months before London turns out to vote. And just before we go to your calls, Daniel, you're going to be the first caller. A quick word with Zac Goldsmith. Mr. Goldsmith, thank you for coming in. How's campaigning going?
All very good, thanks. 88 days.
87
days.
87 days.
Yeah.
Wow.
Every one of them's going to count.
And how's it going out
there? It's going very well, but momentum building up, the real momentum, small m momentum, not Corbyn's momentum. Real momentum is with us, and how
do you gauge that? How do you gauge the small momentum?
You gauge it in hundreds of different ways. Social media, you gauge it with the number of people signing up to volunteer. We've got tens of thousands of people now, really good people, all of them good ambassadors for the campaign. You get it from the reception on the doorstep, public meetings, and so on. There's no doubt that we're getting the message out there.
And how much, lastly, before we go to the first call, how much is housing the issue that's really roaring this time round?
It dominates.
Is it?
Absolutely dominates.
Yeah.
I haven't been to a public meeting or even a small gathering where housing hasn't been the first and last question.
Is that right?
Yeah.
It's as big as that. Well, I sense it'll come forward in our conversation now, Mr. Goldsmith. Put on your headphones and here we go. And although the first question actually is not about this, it's about something else. Daniel is in West Hampstead. You're through to Zac Goldsmith. Daniel, go ahead.
Morning, Daniel.
Morning, Zac. Morning, Mr. London.
Hello, sir.
Zac,
I think that's me, Zac, by the way. Bad luck. Yeah. On you go, Daniel.
Yeah, it was Nick. It was for you, Mr. London. A big fan of yours. Zac, I'd just like to know. Obviously, LBC have been covering the cycle superhighway story, and obviously it is a huge issue for Londoners. I think, especially people who drive in London. My question to you is: what are your plans with regard to the cycle superhighway? Because yes, there are more cyclists in London. Yes, most people want to have a cleaner, safer London, but as a driver and as a London resident who wants to see, London a cleaner place, it is going to cause these new cycle superhighway schemes are going to cause absolute gridlock in London. Especially the new one on the A40, the one in Finchley Road, Regent's Park, all the way down to the West End. What are your plans? Because if you plan to stop them or at least put them onto the back roads, I will vote for you.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I just want to step back briefly for a second. We have a really serious air pollution problem in London. It's not something that the mayor can decide whether or not to deal with. The mayor has to deal with it. 10,000 people every year dying from air pollution. And in addition to that, our population is growing incredibly quickly, about 100,000 new people every year. So we are going to have to find ways of encouraging people to cycle and making cycling safe and pleasant. And we're going to have to accommodate what will be a massive increase in the number of people cycling. It's not a question of if, it's a question of how. And the problem with this debate is it's almost a religious debate. You're either in favour of superhighways or you're against them. And if you're against them, you're against cycling. It's a practical question at the end of the day. My job, if I'm elected in May, will be to look at the 5 that will already have been built by then and where the roadworks will already have cleared and assess them. And if they work, as we're told by the Mayor's office that they will, then that's a thumbs up and you keep on going and you continue with the remaining 4 that are in the pipeline. If they don't work, then you adopt a different policy. So you find a way of accommodating a massive increase in cycling. But if we don't, London will grind to a standstill. But you do it in a way that works. And that means involving everyone, not just talking to the cycling campaigns, but also talking to people who know the roads very well, talking to black cabs. I've had some really useful conversations with black cab drivers and their representatives about how we can accommodate a huge increase of cycling. People who understand our roads. So not a question of if, it's a question of how.
Daniel?
Well, yeah, I understand that, and I understand we have to, reduce air pollution in London. But, for example, it seems that TfL completely ignored the emergency services opinions when it came to the cycle superhighway. And clearly, it doesn't take a road planning expert or an urban planning PhD to realise that taking out major lanes in carriageways through arterial routes and major arterial routes in London, it's going to cause more pollution. Look, Zac, I agree with you. I want a cleaner London, but the cycle superhighways taking out lanes of traffic are going to move the cars and the existing traffic onto the smaller roads in London, and it's causing gridlock already. It's going to cause more pollution with cars sitting idle. So that, don't you see it? It's madness. It's absolute.
Daniel, by May the 5th, there will be 5 already completed and the roadworks will have gone. So we will be in a position then, the new mayor will be in a position to work out whether or not it's been a success. And that's all I can promise.
And it will be judged by traffic flow, presumably?
It will be judged on the basis of impact on emergency services, on the basis of traffic flow, on the basis of how many cyclists use them. I mean, I know plenty of cyclists who don't use them because they prefer sort of quiet ways. They prefer to go down sort of more gentle routes. So you have to look at all these things. If they work, though, then you're going to have to, I would feel obliged to promote them because we know that we have to accommodate a huge number of cyclists, but it's got to be an honest assessment.
So worst case scenario, Mr. Goldsmith, perhaps they're not working, perhaps the fire brigade point to a fire they weren't able to attend, or police couldn't move Her Majesty the Queen safely, or whatever it might be. Would you rip them up?
If the evidence showed that they didn't work, then you'd have no choice but to rip them up. But I hope they do work. I hope it's a successful experiment. We'll see. But you have to take this you have to approach this practically, not in a sort of religious manner that I think some people.
Do you think Boris got a bit religious about it?
I think Boris is right to have prioritised cycling. I think that he's recognised that there is a trend in London, and we need to encourage that trend, and we need to accommodate it. I think this is one string to the bow. He's put a lot of money into tidying up 33 dangerous junctions. He's taken action on HGVs. I think we need a lot more action on HGVs, which are dangerous and polluting and contribute to congestion. I think there's a lot more we need to do about the fact that shopping has changed so completely. The number of people who buy online, and then you've got vans.
And these white vans can't get around. Well, they're not all white, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, but the trouble is things have happened so quickly, and I don't think we have adjusted to that yet. So you've got a van with 2 parcels in the back, competing with everyone else for limited road space. We have to find a way of consolidating those deliveries, and I think we can do a lot working with underground stations, with post offices, even with corner shops, a click and collect service, so that people can collect their package on the way home without having packages delivered to them at work.
Well, this may be the tube stations, possibly.
It could be the tube stations. I think it probably would be the tube station. I don't think it would be limited to tube stations.
No, but
tube stations.
There's some real estate there, isn't there, that could be used.
Plenty of real estate there. But there might be another way for it'd be up to them. But the post offices might want to invent a new reason to make money and exist. They are struggling in some circumstances, and this might be a helpful thing for them to do. But I think we need to get to grips with that problem. That is a trend which is going to grow. And if we don't find a clever way of dealing with it, then London will grind to a standstill.
And just lastly on this, you said that it's almost like a religion. If Boris Johnson is the high priest then of this cycling faith, without doubt the curate will be Andrew Gilligan. Will he stay in post if you become mayor?
I knew you were going to ask that. Look, I'm a big fan of Andrew Gilligan. I've worked with him on lots and lots of different issues. I've known him for years, but I have to tell you, I'm not measuring the curtains. I've got 12 weeks to persuade London to give me the thumbs up, and that's what I'm focused on doing.
So you don't know whether he'd stay in post?
I'm not making any comments or appointments or anything like that.
All right. Daniel, thanks for getting started. James, you're in Greenwich and you're through to Zac Goldsmith. James, go ahead.
Morning, James.
Oh, thanks, Nick. Good morning, Zac. I've been in the housing and development sector for 30 years, and I was very disappointed when, with the housing and planning bill, that your input into that was merely to look to replacing the right to buy properties 2 for 1, which I don't believe is doable in any short-term reasonable time frame. And if I could just come back to the fact that I do not believe, many professionals such as myself have been raising this issue for the last 10 years, we will not build our way out of the housing crisis in London, which is in the short term, that's 5 to 10 years, even on mayoral-owned land where development is horrendously slow, such as at the Greenwich Peninsula. Nothing would convince me as a professional that that's an immediate answer. What we clearly must do on any new development is produce affordable homes, and by that we have to rewrite the London plan and go back to our definitions of social housing and intermediate housing. People in the country are being in the city cannot afford to live 60 to 70% of their incomes going on rent, and in the short term we must regulate landlords, and we must bring in, as Vienna, as Berlin, as Paris, as all major civilized cities have, a form of rent control.
All right, let's get Zac Goldsmith involved, Mr. Goldsmith.
Thank you very much for that. You've raised a lot of different issues there, but I'm going to address the general point first, if I can, and that is the question of supply. I don't think we're going to solve the housing crisis without closing the gap between supply and demand, and a successful housing policy is one that enables an average Londoner on an average income to get the keys to their first home, which is a mile away from where we are at the moment, and that does mean building many more homes, which is why I've committed to doubling the rate of house building to 50,000, which takes us back to the 1930s. We haven't seen that for many, many decades. And the question is, how do you do that? And the answer is land. And that requires doing a deal with government. The government is sitting on huge amounts of land, publicly owned brownfield land throughout London. That's the Ministry of Defence, Ministry of Justice, NHS, and much more besides. Getting that land released from government, handed over to the mayor so we can develop it. And the second thing we need to do, which is also land related, is protect the TfL investment budget so we can grow the transport network work and make that land accessible, because without doing that, we won't be able to solve the housing crisis. And that's the reason, the main point of differentiation between myself and my Labour rival is that I will protect the TfL budget. My rival has said that he will take £1.9 billion out of the budget, which makes all of his housing proposals, all of his housing plans completely...
Why do cheaper tube fares mean we can't have houses, Mr.
Because
Goldsmith?
if you take £1.9 billion out of the TfL budget, that means hacking away at the expansion programmes. It means, for example, not upgrading the City Line, District Line, Metropolitan Line, Hammersmith and City Line. It means not having the night tube. It means not taking over the suburban rail franchises. It means not extending the overground to Barking Riverside. All of those things are projects which will not just keep London moving, but they will also release vast amounts of land for the houses that we need to develop. And I have challenged my rival. I've said, if you're going to take £1.9 billion out of the budget, tell us what you're going to cut. And the only two examples we have so far, cancelling the cable car, which would cost us £20 million to do, as I think you pointed out on a previous programme, previous episode of LBC, and cancelling orders for new route masters, but there are no orders. It is farcical, it's fantasy stuff, and it is a really reckless pledge that Sadiq Khan has made, a pledge which he knows he cannot deliver.
Quick response from you, James. James?
Well, I'm sorry, robbing Peter to pay Paul with small amounts of money, because that's what 1.5 billion is, Zach. The fact of the matter is, on the last two phases of Greenwich Peninsula, the affordable housing's been reduced, and that's government-owned land. So that gives me no assurance whatsoever, and I don't believe you have the experience or the advice at the moment that is convincing anybody in the profession that you can do any better.
Quick response, James.
Yeah, look,
James from Zac. Yeah.
We're going to disagree on the issue of supply. I think supply is absolutely central. Helping people get on the housing ladder is a key and core part of the programme I'm putting forward. But I have to tell you that the housing experts from the left and the right of politics are not in agreement with the proposals being put forward by my rival. You mentioned rent controls a few moments ago. I had a meeting with Shelter yesterday. This is not an organisation that is associated with the Conservative Party. They do not believe rent controls could or would work in London. The issue comes back to supply. If you're talking about London's 2 million renters, many of whom get a pretty raw deal, insecure tenancies, rogue landlords, poor conditions, the answer there is to enable the local authorities to create a blacklist of rogue landlords, which is what the government is doing in the housing bill that you've just criticised, but also increasing supply. And you do that through the London plan. You don't do it through rent controls, which one, don't work, and two, they're not going to happen for the next 4 years because this government opposes them and it requires this government to legislate in order to make them happen.
James, thank you. We move on. Amanda's in Barnet. You're through to Zac Goldsmith. Go ahead, Amanda. Good morning.
Hi, Zac.
Hi.
I have a question about the police. So I understand the Met Commissioner is planning to double the number of armed officers on patrol in London, obviously especially after Paris last year. Yeah. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I very, very strongly support the call by Bernard Hogenhoud to double the number of armed response officers. And it means that effectively, at any given time, there will be 400 armed response officers available to respond to an incident. I don't think anyone doubts that London is a target, that there are serious threats, and anxiety levels across London are at record highs. So I absolutely back him. I think that the police need to know that the mayor is someone who is on their side. When the police put their own lives on the line, they need to know that the mayor is behind them. That means giving them your backing, but it also means making sure they have the tools they need to keep us safe.
Where are we going to get them from, Mr. Goldsmith, the armed officers?
Well, that's...
Because it's a voluntary, remember. You can't be mandated to pick up a gun.
I don't... Look, there are 32,000 officers in London, thanks to Boris having kept his pledge at the last election where he said there would be 32,000 officers. There are. We had, as you remember, a few months ago, a real threat to the police budget. There was talk about £1 billion being stripped out of the Met budget. We fought tooth and nail, bashed down the Chancellor's door and the Home Secretary's door, and we protected that budget. But the advantage of that process is that police thought they were going to have to find monumental savings. So they did that work. They no longer have to make those savings, but a lot of what they discovered shows that there's a great deal of fat in the system. They can reinvest that in the front line, and that's what the Met will do. So this has been a good exercise for the police.
Quick response from you, Amanda.
I think I obviously me and most of the people that I know take the tube every day, and it is definitely a cause of concern that when we're commuting into London or commuting around London. So yes. I think that even though I don't necessarily want more armed a bigger armed presence, it would obviously bring a comfort if it needed to keep us safe.
Amanda, thank you. Sorry, you want to get a word?
I just want to say, look, I can absolutely share that sentiment, but no one, including Bernard Hogenhow and any of the police that I've been speaking to, wants to see militarization of our police. It's not about having, American-style policing on Barnes High Street. It is about having a response unit available to react to, worrying
Probably
incidents.
picked the sleepiest high street
in
London.
Well, I'm just talking, it's not that sleepy. It's where I live.
Oh, is it?
It's a lovely high street.
What use for water cannon?
Well, water cannons, we've talked about this before. I think Boris made the right decision. I think
We can't use them, Mr. Goldsmith.
Well, you can use them, just not everywhere in London. The argument that they can't, there are some streets that are too narrow, but we're talking about legally.
The Home Secretary hasn't authorised them.
I don't believe that if we were in circumstances where the head of police in London said we're going to need to use water cannon, we're losing control of London.
He's got to call her and get authorisation.
A phone call.
Then they've got to be got up from Gravesend.
I don't believe any.
They don't travel particularly quickly, these things.
I don't believe any Home Secretary would say no to the head.
Would you go back to the Home Secretary and say, look, can we have another conversation, please, about water?
I certainly would. Look, I don't want to see water cannons used in London.
Neither does Bernard Hogenhow.
It would be a disaster. I'd hate to see it happen in London, but I like the fact that they exist. I was, like everyone in London, traumatised by what happened during those riots. Even in Richmond and Kingston, the area that I represent, there were people waiting to exploit the fact that the police were going to be taken into central London and other parts of London, waiting with petrol bombs. Now, fortunately, they were not able to use them because the police were still on site in both Richmond and Kingston. But there was a real fear that took hold of London. And I think we should be prepared, not just to use, but not just to have, but to use water cannons in the event that London reaches those kinds of, gets out of control again. And I don't believe that any Home Secretary would stand in the way.
Bit of a contract mess over Bernard Hogenhow at the moment, of course, Mr. Goldsmith. It's possible that he might get another year, which starts a couple of months, whoever wins in the... Would you want him to have another 2 years, 3 years? Is he the man for the job?
I'm a big fan of Bernard Hogenhow. I like the fact that he's very willing and able to hold politicians to account. I've seen him in action. He's stood up to the Home Secretary, which is what you want in your Met Commissioner. I like the fact that he commands the respect of his own team, and that seems to be right across the board. So I think he's doing a good job, and clearly the safety of London is his number one priority.
1, 2 or 3 years.
So I think Boris has done the right thing. It's I have not worked with him as mayor. I've worked with him as an MP and as a mayoral candidate, and I'm hugely impressed by him. And I enjoy meeting him. I see as much of him as I can to talk about all the issues that we're talking about at the moment. But I appreciate the fact that if I'm elected on May the 5th, I will have a year to work with him to make that assessment for myself. So I think we're in the right place on that.
Okay. And lastly, he may be very good at holding others to account. He's been held to account himself over Lord Bramall. It's shameful he's still yet to apologise. Yeah,
look, I think that is it's about the most serious thing you can accuse someone of. And Lord Bramall is decorated. These people have used the term hero. And I think that what he has been through is grotesque. Now, clearly the police have to take all allegations very seriously, and they're right to do so. But where the police get it wrong, of course, there should be an apology. From him, absolutely.
Yeah. We move on. Amanda, thanks. Maureen's in Waterloo. I think I know what this might be about. Morning, Maureen.
Hello, yeah, you're right. It's about the Garden Bridge.
Morning, Maureen.
Zac, I heard recently that you would support the bridge, in spite of all the recent controversy over it. This bridge is so unnecessary. £60 million of taxpayers' money to a private bridge can't be right. Even on this show last week, Boris was trying to defend himself about when he went to the States to fundraise for this bridge at the expense of taxpayers' money, I might add. Heatherwick, the designer, also attended. Boris told Nick that Mr. Heatherwick was there only because it was his idea. This is such a porky. It was not his idea. It was Joanna Lumley's idea.
Right.
Boris, who has known Joanna since he was 4, when she wrote to him and said, please say yes to the loveliest bridge, Boris said, yes, dear. 30 million.
So what is your question? Because neither Boris nor, unfortunately, I'd love to have Joanna Lumley here, but she's not. So your question to Zac Goldsmith, who is here, is what, Maureen?
Why are you backing this bridge when we don't need it? We've got umpteen bridges over the Thames, and why are you taking this money of taxpayers' money when it could be built?
Okay, stay on the line, Maureen.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, on the first point, we're going to disagree. I do think the design is beautiful. I think it's iconic. I think in the years to come, it will be a really celebrated part part of the London landscape. I just don't believe that once this bridge is built that people will look upon it with regret. I think they'll be pleased that this new green space exists in London, and I'm pretty sure that thousands of people will get engaged on this bridge every year. I think it's going to be an important part of London. So from that point of view, I think we're probably going to have to disagree. But you mentioned £60 million of public money. The project will cost around £175 million beginning to end. The vast majority of that is privately raised. It's not public money. And the public contribution actually is around £10 million. So £30 million of the 60 is the government waiving VAT. It's not going to cost the public any money. And of the remaining 30 coming from TfL, 20 is a loan. So in terms of actual public money, we're talking about £10 million. And I would say that the new Garden Bridge, this new green space, something very, very beautiful that people will absolutely love, I'm sure of that, £10 million, I think, is good value for money.
So people can get engaged, Mr. Goldsmith?
I think people will get engaged on
so that's what we're spending £10 million for, so people can get engaged.
That's not why it's been built. But imagine yourself 50 years ago as a 40-year-old man.
A little offensive, but go ahead.
With a beautiful... I can imagine this bridge being a really romantic and important part of
what if
London.
it isn't a bridge? You're aware, of course, that it's going to start...
But also, I'm correct, because this is not a private bridge. This will be open every
But it's not
day
even a bridge yet. It hasn't got permission to land south of the water. So now it could become a pier.
It needs to be a bridge. I mean, absolutely. But
so should it start if it hasn't got effectively landing permission the other side of the water?
I think the City Hall needs to sort the planning permission situation out so that it becomes a bridge. But my understanding is that both
would you support a pier?
I'd be much more interested in a bridge.
No, that's not quite answering the question. Would you support a pier?
I'd have to think very carefully about it. I would be less drawn to the idea of a pier.
Well, what's the point of having a pier?
I'm not going to argue with you. It's a bridge. I was talking about a bridge. I don't believe it'll be
still
a pier.
Still 3.5 million of our money to maintain it each year. I have a figure here.
That's a commitment, a guarantee, but it's not. That's effectively it's been underwritten.
Right.
But the assessment.
Do you think Londoners want to spend that money?
But the assessment is that it won't cost 3.5 million or anything close to that. And the official assessment is that it will cost next to nothing to maintain. That it'll be maintained through private sources. But that remains to be seen. But TfL is committed to spending up to 3.5 a year.
Maureen, we'll talk again. Thank you. Sheila's in Harlow. You're on the radio, Sheila. Go ahead.
Yes. Hello, Nick. Hello, Zach.
Yeah.
Hello,
Zach,
Sheila.
I wanted to speak to you about education.
Yeah.
Now, not that long ago, although I suppose it is long ago, when David Cameron decided to send his daughter to private
state school,
ordinary state school.
State school, yeah.
And obviously to get the ordinary person's vote for the election. But what I'm saying is now he's decided that his son will go to private school.
He might be, yes.
Tell us, Zach, about the state of our state schools. They must be rubbish, really, when you've got the Prime Minister saying they're not good enough for my son. He will be going to the private school. Surely this is not good enough as the Prime Minister. Shouldn't he be setting an example and trying to improve our education in our very difficult schools at the moment?
Look, the school story, Sheila, in London, actually in the whole of the country, but particularly in London, is a good one. There are 1 million more people today going to good or outstanding
Why is the Prime
schools.
Minister possibly sending his son to one non-state?
I would feel very uncomfortable talking about the Prime Minister's family choices. I just genuinely think that when a politician makes a decision for their children or their family in order to make political points, I think that's wrong. I think it's seedy, and it's not a good look. And it happens all the time. But it's not something that I would.
But it's not really fair, is it? These schools are right for your kids, but my son's going to this elite school over here.
This is a choice of a father, not a Prime Minister, and it's a father making a decision for his kids on the basis of what he thinks is right for his kids. And I do not feel that it is my position.
What would you do with your children?
I'm not going to talk about my kids.
You don't?
I do have kids.
No, I know you don't, but we don't know whether they're state or private.
I'm not going to talk about. I've never involved my kids in any aspect of my political life. You'll never find them on my literature. I don't want to involve them in that process, and I think that it's a decision I took a long time ago, and I would always take. But I just think on the school story generally, there has been massive progress after the last 5 years, and I think that it's one of the good stories of the coalition government.
Well, not good enough for Mr. Cameron, perhaps.
We have problems in London in terms of capacity, and if you ask me as a mayoral candidate what I would do, obviously I can't set the curriculum, I can't set the funding for our schools. That is a decision for government. But what the mayor can do is make sure that whenever we free up public land to build new developments, we ensure there's enough provision for school places. We are on on the edge of what could become a schools crisis in London, with about 175,000 places short, and the only way to accommodate that, and these are secondary schools, which are quite hard, the big areas that are required. It's a challenge to find land to build the new schools that we're going to need. But I think that is a prime responsibility of the mayor.
Let's get a couple of email questions because we're coming to the last couple of minutes. Wendy in West Wickham says, you become mayor in May and then it's revealed the government wants to go ahead with Heathrow Airport. What would you do?
It is not going to happen. My job now, as an MP, as a backbench
How do you know
MP...
it's not going to? Mr Cameron told you that.
I'll tell you why it's not going to happen, is that Heathrow has been subjected now to an air pollution test. Now, anyone who is following this issue, anyone who has any interest in this issue, knows that Heathrow cannot pass an air pollution test. It can't even get close to passing an air pollution test. So the only way that we'll get a green light for Heathrow is if that air pollution test is rigged by government. And my job as a backbench MP and as a mayoral candidate is to make sure it's not rigged.
Why are they trying to rig it?
I know, so there's no evidence that they are. There are plenty of people who are very keen to push ahead with Heathrow expansion, and even more people who are keen to stop it.
The basic tone of the Davis report was Heathrow, wasn't it? That's a fair interpretation.
Well, see, it's semi-fair. I'm going to dispute that, because if you read the report itself...
I haven't read it in all.
I should think almost no one listening to this programme has. It's my job to read it, so I did read it. The report
that was
itself...
a thrilling night.
I know, it was more than a night. The report itself makes the strongest possible case against Heathrow expansion. The conclusion is for Heathrow expansion, and the two just don't stitch together, which is why I've always thought the conclusion was written before the report was compiled. It dismantles...
But suppose shock of shocks, Mr Goldsmith, it happens. You're sitting at the mayor's office, the phone goes, and it's the Prime Minister. Look, I'm terribly sorry, but we've found for Heathrow.
I think I'm going to make a boast. I don't think there's anyone, and certainly no politician in the country, who's done more to knock Heathrow off the agenda than I have, and I will continue to do what I need to do to ensure that Heathrow doesn't happen. But it won't happen. We've won this campaign. I'm absolutely certain of that.
You really don't see it happening?
I don't see it happening. I think the most important consideration for government, I mean, air quality is key, clearly, and so are noise and all the other issues, but the most important consideration is the economic one, and the economic case for Heathrow expansion has just completely crumbled over the last few months, partly as a result of the Airports Commission review, which dismantled the economic case beautifully.
And one question from me, has David Cameron done enough to make the case for staying in Europe as and when the vote comes about for you?
We clearly know what side he is going to be on in this debate. We have seen a very, very early stage draft agreement.
Well, he's off to the middle of this month. He's off to Brussels, isn't he?
And we don't know what's going to emerge at the end of that.
But what he got last week with Mr Tusk, is it good enough for you, Zac Goldsmith?
I'm going to give you a bit of a politician's answer, and I apologise for that. But I made a commitment when I stood for election at the last election. I stood on a manifesto that said that the PM would do his best to renegotiate our relationship, and he'd put it to the public in a referendum, something I've campaigned for all my life. We are at that stage now. We know the vote's going to happen. We know that people will have their say. There will be a mandate, whatever decision is made. But as a courtesy to the Prime Minister, I want to see him finish that process, and I want to be able to judge the final offer on the basis of what's in the national interest, what's in London's interest.
Isn't that not what we saw last week, then?
I don't think so. I think it was the first step in a journey. I don't believe that...
A strong step?
I'm not going to exaggerate. It's not the strongest step in the world, but it is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, Boris Johnson says more needs to be done.
Clearly, it is a step in the right direction. But I have always said that I want to see meaningful reforms, a meaningful package, and I'll take a view on the basis of that. So you call me, if you bear to have me back in 2 or 3 weeks when the reforms are there, we will talk about it then.
I look forward to that. Zac Goldsmith, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.
Phone Zac, of course, the Conservative candidate to be mayor.
Well, that's certainly true, John. And yes, you're right. The public as a whole want to see a huge reduction in the foreign aid budget, as do I. You know, I don't think that sending a cheque every year to the same government is actually a way of solving or helping anybody.
Are we getting